77 was sort of the year that New York City hit rock bottom. It was also the creative peak of the downtown scene, the era around CBGB's and Max's Kansas City. A young poet is found dead in his apartment with a heroin needle hanging out of his arm. The cops think that it was just an accidental OD, but his friends think that he was murdered.
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. I'm Eric Senich. Gabriel Rotello. He is the author of the new book titled The CBGB Conspiracy. Welcome to the podcast, Gabriel.
Thank you, Eric. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for coming on. I always love reading fiction books that mix in some rock and roll. And in this case, we've got some New York City CBGB rock and roll. And the book, actually, it's interesting because it mixes fiction with a host of real events and historical figures. Tell us what the story is about.
So the CBGB Conspiracy is a murder mystery that takes place in 1977 in New York City on the downtown scene around CBGB's. 77 was sort of the year that New York City hit rock bottom. It was the year of the great blackout of 77. It was the year of the Son of Sam. It was the peak of crime, 6 murders a day in the city. And it was also the creative peak of the downtown scene, the era around CBGB's and Max's Kansas City, when so many new bands were forming. It was the beginning of punk rock. It was also the beginning of hip hop, and a lot of other things as well. And in the book, a young poet a guy is found dead in his apartment with a heroin needle hanging out of his arm. And the cops, beleaguered and overworked, think that it was just an accidental OD, and they decide not to investigate. But his friends think that he was murdered. And so they begin investigating themselves. And his best friend, Finn, goes to his apartment the next night to see if there's any clues there. And when he gets there, William Burroughs, the great beat writer William Burroughs, is coming out of the apartment. And so he immediately begins to suspect that Burroughs, who was a famous junkie, was responsible for the kid's death. And that's how it begins. And then it goes on a sort of a wild goose chase through the scene of CBGB's and Max's, the art scene, the music scene, the fashion scene, mixing real events like the blackout and the Son of Sam, etc., and real people like William Burroughs and Herbert Huncke and all the great downtown people that I knew back then, with a fictional story of this murder, which we finally at the end will solve.
Tell us about your history with the city of New York. You mentioned people that you knew.
Yeah, so I moved to New York in 74, right after college when I was 21 years old. And it was a very fortuitous time to move there because the city was melting down. 1 million people had left the city. And so it was extremely inexpensive to live. It's amazing when people think today of Manhattan in particular, of being an enclave primarily for millionaires. And the smallest little tiny apartment is $3,500 or $4,000. My first apartment was $90 a month, right in Manhattan, down the downtown scene. And so was everybody else's. So as older people were moving out of New York, younger people were moving in, and it became a nexus for art, people that wanted to be writers, artists, musicians, and there was just this huge scene going on. And that's right when I arrived there. I had trained as a musician as a kid, really to be a classical musician, but I wanted to be a rock and roll musician. And one of the main places to do that was New York City. And I'm from just outside New York City. So that is where I moved and immediately connected with that scene and spent the next 15 years working as a musician in New York, not always on the downtown scene, but in the beginning on the downtown scene, and hanging out at CBGB's, one of my favorite places to hang out. And because it was such a tiny scene when it first started, late 74, early 75, CB's really began, it had been there for a couple of years. Hilly Crystal, who was a major character in the CBGB Conspiracy, founded CBGB's as a blues and bluegrass and country place on the Bowery. And the Bowery was arguably the most dysfunctional street in America for most of the 20th century. It was where all the missions were that catered to alcoholics and what in those days, we wouldn't say it today, I guess, but in those days people called Bowery bums. So the street was just littered with drunk people lying in the streets, fires burning, and garbage cans. It was not the kind of place that you really wanted to go out to a club, particularly at night. And that's where Hilly opened his club. And it was not doing very well. For the first few years, the only people that were in there were Bowery bums and the Hells Angels, who had a big house, a big tenement building right around the corner, and they hung out there too. But nobody much else showed up until one day Richard Lloyd and Tom Verlaine of the group Television were walking up the street and saw Hilly working on his awning, the now famous awning of CBGB's. They looked inside, they saw that it was this huge room with a great stage in the back and a really major sound system. And they said, "Hey, what is this?" He said, "It's a bluegrass place." And they said, "Well, we don't play bluegrass, but can we play here?" So he said, "Yeah, why not? Nobody else really seems to want to." And their manager, Terry Orr, made sure that they drew a big crowd on their first night. There's probably more people than Hilly had seen there since he opened the place. And so he invited them back for a residency to play every Thursday, Friday, Saturday night for 6 weeks. And because the scene was a very small scene, and because the guys in Television, Tom Verlaine and Richard Lloyd, knew everybody else on the scene, like Patti Smith and Debbie Harry and the Talking Heads and none of the Ramones, none of whom were known yet, most of whom hadn't even played any place yet. They all came to see Television play there and saw what a cool place it was and asked Hilly if they could play there too. And he said yes. And so they began to play, and a little tiny scene began to evolve there. I was at the time very good friends with Richard Soul, who was the keyboard player of the Patti Smith group. And he told me about it and said, "Patti's going to be playing there, next Thursday. You got to come see us in this cool place on the Bowery." And I was like, "The Bowery? What are you talking about?" But I went anyway to see Patti and was blown away by the place. One thing about CB's, by the way, despite the squalor of the club itself, both the street outside and the club inside, it had a fantastic sound system. Hilly was always meticulous about the sound system. He didn't empty the ashtrays. They didn't mop the floor. They didn't clean the place out. It stank in there. You kind of got a slight headache when you'd go in. But the sound system was fantastic. And so a scene began to develop, and it was a very tiny scene at first, for the first maybe year or so. And the thing that was really important about it to me was that Hilly, he was devoted to only originals. He didn't want anybody to play covers. He only wanted original bands. And if he liked you, he let you come back over and over and over again to play many, many times, or even do residencies. Patti Smith had a residency there where you would play for a month, 6 weeks, 2 months, whatever. The thing is, most musicians can attest is that, 1 hour of performing in front of people on stage is worth 10 hours of rehearsal, just rehearsing. There's just something great about performing live. And so people who started out not very good got good pretty fast. In fact, pretty much everybody was not very good. Patti Smith already was. I will say this, Patti and her band, Lenny Kaye, Richard Soul, JD, and Ivan Krala, they were quite good. But most everybody else, the first time I saw them, including Blondie, were just not that great, but they got good in short order because they had this opportunity to play in front of people. And a buzz began to happen, and the press began snooping around and writing stories about it. And slowly over that first year, it became better known, and more people began showing up to find out what all the talk was about. And it just grew into a scene. And then the record labels showed up, and people began getting signed. The Ramones, and then Patti Smith, and then Blondie, and then Talking Heads, and all these other bands, the Shirts, there was a million of them, the Dead Boys, just tons of bands. And by 77, when the CBGB Conspiracy takes place, it had now become such a popular place that Hilly began complaining to me that he was losing money because the place wasn't big enough. He now had more people on the sidewalk outside than he was able to let into the club because it only held a couple of hundred people. And he began looking for a new place that he could open that would be much bigger. and he found it in this old Yiddish theater on 2nd Avenue and 4th Street called the Anderson Theater. And he took that over and turned it into what he called the CBGB Theater. So now there was CBGBs on the Bowery and this much bigger place, like the size of the Fillmore East, a big old theater that he called the CBGB Theater. But he felt that he was being sabotaged because everything was going wrong with that building. He wasn't being sabotaged. He had just purchased a building that was in such terrible shape that it needed way more work than he could possibly afford. And so it failed in really kind of spectacular fashion. There was no heat. The bathrooms didn't work. Bands were freezing. They couldn't play because their fingers were too cold. And he closed it within a few months. And it was really a financial disaster for Hilly that he never really recovered from. But I took that and wove that into the book as well. And in the book, it is being sabotaged by the same people that are responsible for the murder that takes place in the beginning of the book. It's all interconnected. And so I sort of solve the crime of what happened to the CBGB Theater, even though it wasn't a crime. I turned it into one and solved that in the course of the book too, as well as several other real crimes.
Fantastic story. How do you think the city shaped you differently than any other place could have?
Well, I mean, New York has always been a kind of a different place. I guess every place is different from every place else, but New York always had this sense that you were kind of in the fishbowl, sort of in the center of things, because it's not just a music town. It was also a literary town, a media town, an art town, sort of the center of the art world, a fashion town, the center of the fashion world. And my friends on that scene, who were gay, because I'm gay, and most of my friends that were on the CBGB's scene were also gay, although CBGB's was not a gay place by any stretch of the imagination, but there were a lot of gay people there. They were all from different elements of the different scenes in New York. I mean, Stephen Sprouse and Stephen Meisel, people like that went on to stellar careers in fashion. People like Jean-Michel Basquiat went on to amazing careers in art. People went on to amazing careers in literature and writing, as well as music. So it really was a thing that you don't get necessarily in every other city, where you're sort of in the center of all of these huge cultural movements. And amazingly enough, the downtown scene, which is, and by the way, downtown New York, for people that don't know, it's basically from Houston Street up to about 14th Street, and from maybe Avenue A over to about 8th Avenue. It's about 1 square mile. And in those days, because it was so inexpensive, pretty much everybody who wanted to do those kinds of things lived in that 1 square mile. So everybody went to the same clubs, went to the movies in the same movie theaters, ate in the same restaurants, and bumped into each other all the time. You just go out and walk around on the streets like a demented college campus.
I was going to say college campus. Yeah.
Where except that the people that you're bumping into are not your friends from college. They're people that are about to go on to these amazing careers as Blondie or as Jean-Michel Basquiat or, whoever. So it was really an amazing time and an amazing place. It did not last. Gentrification began eating away at it as early as the early 1980s. And by the late 1980s, already there was an exodus out to Brooklyn and to far-flung places like that, because people simply could not afford anymore. You could not find an apartment for $90 a month. You couldn't find an apartment for $900 a month. All of a sudden, everything was $1,500 or $2,000, and kids who just, arriving in the city at the age of 21 cannot afford that. So they moved away. The scene dissipated and kind of dissolved. But for about 10 years, it was really amazing.
Did the artists back then know they were part of something historic, or they're just trying to survive day to day?
Trying to survive and to do art day to day. I don't even think that survival was that much on people's minds. It was more like what they're doing with their art, their music, their writing, whatever. But no, people had no idea that what was happening there was going to resonate beyond there. I mean, when you think about it, in the 70s, I mean, rock and roll sort of began in the 60s. And when it began, It replaced what had happened before that, which was what was going on in the 40s and 50s, and that was just discarded. I mean, you think of big band music and stuff like that was just discarded. And when rock began, people thought that that would be discarded. Even the Beatles said at some point early in their career that we're only going to be able to do this for a couple of years because we're just going to go out of fashion and people aren't going to want to hear us anymore. And we still had that attitude in the 70s. It hadn't been that long, and people just assumed that whatever we're doing right now is what we're doing right now, but another generation of kids is going to come along in a few years and we will all be just forgotten. We'll sort of be like Bing Crosby or, Tommy Dorsey or something like that, and they'll be doing a new thing. The fact that it has lasted and that young people today are still very interested in that kind of music, the music of the late 60s, 70s, 80s, is not something that we ever anticipated. And it's something that still astonishes me today. I mean, I'm very happy about it because everywhere I go, when you go shopping in a store, the music that they're playing is very frequently not the music that's popular right now, but music from the 70s.
Isn't that great? Yeah.
Yeah, and you see young kids, I mean, the kids behind the counter that are in their 20s and they're nodding to the music and they're lip syncing the lyrics because they know all the words to, a Led Zeppelin song or whatever. And it's like, dude, that was like 50 years before you were born. Like, how do you even know that? But
it's amazing.
Know it.
They got the Ramones t-shirts and the Blondie t-shirts, and you see them all around. Yeah.
And the CBGB's t-shirts.
Oh, yeah. CBGB, just that name just represents something. Just it's a defining period in history, represents youth. It represents fighting against mainstream culture.
It does, and it also represents something that I think that people are mourning a little bit, the loss of a little bit these days, which is community, a sense of real physical community, not sort of electronic internet community, but places that you can go where everybody, that line from Cheers, you want to go where everybody knows your name kind of thing. That was still very, very much the case on the downtown scene. And I flip-flopped back and forth between the West Village, which was the gay side of downtown, and the East Village, which was the sort of the punk rock side of downtown. And I had my key places in the West Village and my key places in the East Village, and all my friends went to those places. You didn't have to go with anybody. Just walk in the door and you'll immediately see a zillion people that you know and hang out with, and you influence each other. The artists influence the musicians influence the fashion designers. And I think that has dissipated to a certain extent. And I think that when people look back at that, they wish that was still going on. And I think in some places it is still going on, but it's a little more atomized now than it was back then.
As a gay man, you didn't feel danger. Well,
there was the famous incident. I happened to be there that night with Jane County and handsome Dick, Manitoba, where Jane County was Wayne County. Jane County was an early sort of transgender person who actually changed his name from Wayne to Jane, and was a punk rock person, and got a lot of shit for that. And one night was getting a lot of flack from a guy in the crowd who was also a rock and roll singer, Dick Manitoba, and he was saying very homophobic things to Jane as he was walking in front of the stage at CB's. In order to get to the bathrooms at CB's, you had to literally get up and walk right in front of the stage and sort of block out the band for a second. It was sort of
I heard the bathrooms were kind of dangerous too.
That's the thing. I never went to the bathroom because there was an alley outside. I would go out if I had to pee. I'd go outside, go around.
I have heard that before. Yeah,
it's literally in a museum now. It's so skanky that it's literally been recreated in a museum. But anyway, so Dick was walking by and he said some really homophobic things to Jane, and Jane had the mic stand. So Jane picked up the mic stand and smashed him over the head and shoulder, gravely injuring him. I mean, he was very injured and was in the hospital for quite some time. So there was that so there was homophobia. I mean, it was the 70s. There was homophobia, but it was not bad. And most people were very welcoming, and many of the most prominent people on that scene were gay. So, I mean, how homophobic could it really be? I think the thing that happened with Jane and Dick was more of an aberration. So I always felt completely welcome there.
You include real figures in the story. You mentioned it. Tell us about that. And how did you decide who would appear in the book?
Well, the genesis of the book really was that people had been telling me for a long time that I should write a memoir because I've done all these different things and I saw that scene and then I became a journalist and I was an AIDS activist and then I became a TV producer. So you need to write a memoir. And I just didn't really want to write a memoir about the 70s because of the 80s, because of what was going to happen to my gay friends in the 80s, which was that the AIDS epidemic was going to descend, and many of them, the majority of them, were going to die pretty horrible deaths just a few years later. So I just said, no, I won't write a memoir. But then one day I was walking down the street and I thought, well, what if instead of writing it as a memoir, what if I wrote it as a novel, as a fiction, like as a murder mystery, and then just brought my deceased friends back to life to sort of solve, to have fun, to have fun doing this fun thing, which is trying to solve this murder. And it just struck me as like, wow, that would be kind of like writing a memoir, but it would be a lot more fun. And I wouldn't have to worry about what was going to come later. Just concentrate on this 1 2 or 3 month period of time when we were all still healthy and creative and having fun. So that was the genesis of it. And the people that I brought back were just the people that I knew back then, all of whom are deceased, because I didn't want to bring live. I mean, there are a lot of people from that scene that are still alive. And I mentioned people, there are characters in the book, like Patti Smith is a character in the book, and Deborah Harry is a character from Blondie, is a character in the book, but they're not actually characters with speaking roles. You go see Debbie Harry and she's up on stage playing, or Blondie is, or Patti Smith is going to be is playing in a concert, and you're at the concert where Patti Smith is playing. But the people that I actually brought back to life, as it were, are all public figures and they're all deceased. So I felt more freedom to sort of play with them in this fun fictional way. And then it was just a question of like channeling them and remembering what they were like and trying to think of how they would have reacted in the circumstances that I placed them in this fictional crime. And that was really fun. I just really enjoyed writing it so much. And I'm thrilled that people are liking it. And I'm particularly thrilled that the people who were there then, one of their main comments, people will say, oh, it's a wonderful murder mystery. I didn't figure out who done it until the very end. There were a good plot twist and everything. But the thing I loved the most about it was that I felt like I was back there. Like you brought me back. And I just like on every page, I just kept having this feeling like, wow, I had forgotten what it felt like. And this book is making me remember what it felt like. And for some friends, I was talking to somebody yesterday who said that for him, reading it was a very bittersweet thing. He's actually mentioned briefly in one page of the book, it's a particular friend of mine, Richard Ottens, and he said, I just was drawn into the sense of promise. I'm an old man now, and then I was young, and I had my whole future was in front of me, and I had that whole sense in reading the book that everybody was young and everybody's future was ahead of them. And I just kept turning the pages and going, yeah, this is exactly what it felt like, and I don't feel that way anymore. So it's bittersweet for me to read it, but I'm very pleased that people feel that way about it because I worked very hard to try to channel 1977, which was a rough year.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody could do it the justice that you give it unless it's somebody like yourself who lived through it, and you can tell. And you mentioned the character William S. Burroughs. Now, he's a significant character in the story. He had a controversial reputation in real life, both as a literary icon and a figure connected to heroin addiction and a tragic shooting early in his life. When you decided a real historical figure would fall under suspicion, was he your first instinct, or did other names come to mind?
No, that was actually literally. So first I came up with the idea of doing a murder mystery. And then I was like, what would the murder mystery be? Now I have to invent a murder mystery. And I'm thinking, walking my dog one day in Los Angeles, thinking, what is the murder mystery going to be? And then I get that idea of a kid is found dead in his loft from a heroin overdose. His friends suspect that it was given to him deliberately. And in William Burroughs' book, Naked Lunch, on the second page of Naked Lunch, one of the characters, the Gimp, is murdered with a hot shot, what's called a hot shot to the arm, deliberate overdose of heroin takes place in that book. And I knew that because I've read that book a few times. And I'm just walking down the street, walking my dog, and I thought, what if a kid is found dead with a heroin needle in his arm, and his friend goes to investigate, and William Burroughs comes out the door. He suddenly thinks, "Oh my God, it was Burroughs!" So that was literally the genesis of the mystery. Like the whole story came from that thing. I got so excited by that, and then the hard work became, okay, well, now you have to build this whole murder mystery. And is it really going to be Burroughs, or is it going to be somebody else who really does it? And there's going to be plot twists and turns and all that kind of thing. And how can we bring in all the other stuff that happened in the 70s, including the blackout, etc. So but that was the initial inspiration, was that idea of William.
He was the guy from the get-go. Yeah.
Yeah. And his place, by the way, I had gone to dinner once there in probably 77, because he used to have dinner parties there. And he lived across the street from CBGB. He lived on the Bowery, in a huge old building, that was a YMCA in the 1800s. And it had been decommissioned, and it was now sort of artist lofts and things like that. And he lived in the men's locker room of the YMCA. This sort of cement, the huge cement room with like 5 foot thick walls and hardly any windows, because he was a big gun nut and he loved doing target practice. And he would do target practice in that loft, like right in New York City. He was blasting away with these huge guns in his place. So we called it the bunker, because it was like a bunker. And I remember going there and having dinner with a bunch of other, sort of downtown luminaries that night. And I did not realize until I had finished writing the book, and it was actually getting ready to be published, that after he left New York in around 1980 or so, another poet who lived upstairs in another loft, John Giorno, who was a very prominent poet and artist and a person who had considerable financial resources, took over Burroughs' loft, took over the bunker, and preserved it exactly as it was when Burroughs lived there. I mean, the furniture, the rugs on the floor, the art on the walls, everything about it, including his orgone box. He had this famous orgone box that he used to sit in, this box that you're supposed to go in and sit down inside, and orgone from the universe will come and, jazz you up and cure you of all of your stuff. It was one of those esoteric kinds of things. He was very into all that kind of stuff. Even the orgone box is there. And then I found out that it has been preserved, and they give readings there. And the foundation, the John Giorno Foundation, he is passed away as well, gives readings there. So I went there to see if I had remembered it correctly, because there was still time to fix the book. I had only been there once. It was, 50 years ago. So I was like this vague memory. So I went to an event there, to see if I remembered it correctly, because I had time to change the description of it in the book. And to my pleasant surprise, I didn't have to change a word. It was exactly as I remembered it, which kind of blew my mind. But it also made me think, when you think of like how much New York City has changed from 1977 until now. And when you think of how much the Bowery has changed, because as I said before, it was like the most dysfunctional street in America. And now, like every place else in Manhattan, it's outdoor cafes,
Sure,
and
yeah.
Whole Foods, and shiny, beautiful luxury condominiums. I mean, you can't even believe when you walk down the Bowery that I want to grab people and shake them and say, do you have any idea, the ghosts that you're walking on here?
Taxi Driver with De Niro, does that pretty much paint a
Yes.
pretty
Yes.
realistic picture
Yeah.
of New York?
That was 74, and that
Right.
was actually the final scene of Taxi Driver, where they carry the bodies out, and the crowd is waiting outside, and the paramedics carry the bodies out. That, believe it or not, was shot on the block that I lived on in the East Village then.
Really?
And, yes. And one day, I had food poisoning, and I was lying in my apartment. I had two roommates. I was lying in my apartment, like really, really horribly sick from food poisoning. And my two roommates come in and say, "Come on, we got to go downstairs. They're shooting the scene of this movie, and they want extras. They want a crowd of people to be standing around, and we're going to go do it." And I was like, "I'm sorry, I can't. I am so sick that I cannot." So you guys go. So they went, and then the movie comes out, and there they are. The camera hands, and there's Mark and James. Like they, for a second, they fill up the whole screen. It was like, damn.
Oh
If
my
I
God,
had,
you could have been in it.
if I hadn't had food poisoning, I would have been in Taxi Driver because it was right across the street. But even that block, which was 13th Street between 2nd and 3rd Avenues, is now gorgeous block, all the apartments. I mean, I think our apartment there, that was my second apartment, was like, I think it was $160 a month. And those apartments are probably like 4,000, 4,500 a month, that kind of thing now. So yeah, the downtown scene has changed. But anyway, so of all the things that have changed, the idea that William Burroughs' loft is the one thing that's still exactly the same as it was in 1977, the time of the CBGB conspiracy, is just tickles me tremendously.
Thanks so much for checking out the Booked on Rock podcast. If you've just found the podcast, welcome. If you've been listening, thank you so much for your support. And make sure you tell a friend, a family member, share on social media, and let people know about Booked on Rock. And if you do like the podcast, make sure you subscribe, give a 5-star review wherever you listen to the Booked on Rock podcast. We're on Amazon, Apple, iHeart, Spotify, Spreaker, TuneIn, and on YouTube Music. You can check out the full episodes on video, along with video highlights from episodes on the Booked on Rock YouTube channel. Find it at Booked on Rock. Thanks again for listening. Now back to the show. Why was Patti Smith the right focal point for the looming, quote unquote, event in the story? Was there a specific reason for having that?
Well, because the opening night, I mean, I don't want to give too much away or do any spoilers, but the book concludes, it turns out that there is a big plot and there are murderers and things are really bad, and something really bad is going to happen on the night that Hilly opens the CBGB theater on 2nd Avenue, this converted theater that he converted, that something was planned to happen there by the bad guys that was really, really bad. And that opening night was a real opening night, and Patti Smith was the actual headliner that night. So it made sense to have it be Patti, because it's, again, I was trying to wind real things that actually happened in 1977 through this fictional murder mystery. And so that's why it was Patti.
Gabriel Rotello, the author of the new book titled The CBGB Conspiracy. Finn Burden he's both the investigator, he's also an addict. What did you want his heroin struggle to symbolize about that era? Was there a specific?
Well, heroin was really big on the downtown scene in the 1970s. It's not that everybody did it. I didn't really, well, I did it once and I didn't really like it. So I was saved from the temptation.
Sure were, yeah.
It made me sick.
From what I hear.
I was like, I'm not going to do that anymore. It was really horrible.
Yeah.
But there was a sense then that if you really wanted to be cool, I mean, remember the time that we're in, it's 1977. So the 50s were the great explosion of bebop jazz in New York, 52nd Street, all that stuff. The 60s was sort of the beats. The late 50s and the 60s were sort of the beats, and heroin played a big role in all of that. And all of that stuff was still going on. I mean, bebop jazz was still going on, and the whole beat thing was still going on. And so heroin had this aura about it that if you really wanted to be cool, the really cool kids did heroin. And a lot of people messed up their lives really badly from that. They thought that they were being cool. They thought that they could keep it under control. And some people did. The guy that was the model for Finn did to a certain extent, but a lot of people didn't. And that opening scene where Lucien Lowe, the beautiful young 21-year-old poet, is found dead with a heroin needle sitting at his kitchen table in his East Village tenement actually happened to a friend of mine. It was actually a woman, Jessie Blue, not a guy, but a good friend of mine was actually found dead with a heroin needle in her arm sitting at her kitchen table. That kind of stuff happened a lot. So if you were going to tell the story and bring back what it was really like to be on the downtown scene in the 1970s, heroin had to be a part of that. Heroin and a lot of other drugs, but heroin had to be a part of it because it was a part of it.
Tell us about Julie, the character Julie. Is she the moral center of the story?
Well, Julie has an interesting evolution because Julie is the girlfriend of the deceased boy, Lucien, and Finn is his best friend. Her journey is that she was abused as a child. She comes from a very rich family, half English nobility and half Indian from India, sort of industrial nobility, if you will, super rich family, billionaires, I guess. But she was abused as a child. And she's come to New York from England to sort of, get away from stuffy old England. And she falls in love with the downtown scene. She becomes the it girl of 1977 and sort of a punk goddess. But she's struggling with her demons. And in the course of the story, she basically comes to realize that she's being a little too strident and that she needs to sort of put her money where her mouth is, particularly when it comes to people that have also been abused, and that she has the power to do that because she is so wealthy. So she has a real arc. But my favorite arc in the book is Detective Sharon. It's basically a three-character book. A lot of books are focused on a main character, some focus on a couple, but sometimes you focus on three characters. This is a three-character book. And the third character is the police detective, Detective Sharon. He's in his 40s. He's about the same age as Hilly Crystal. He fancied himself a beat poet when he was younger. That didn't work out. Became a police detective, but he still is in love with the beats. He's in love with Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac and William Burroughs and Herbert Huncke and all those people. And he hates the punks. He thinks that punk is the worst thing that ever happened. He's been annoyed at all the different trends of folk rock and glitter rock and the hippie thing, all the different things that people went through in the 10 years before punk. He thought they were all terrible, but punk is by far the worst one. And he doesn't realize that actually the early punk, the punk that I'm talking about, the punk of 1977, which was very poetical. I mean, people like Patti Smith, they were real poets. They are real poets. Very intellectual, all that. But they were really the beats of that time. They were basically carrying on the legacy of the beat poets, and they idolized people like Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs and became friends with Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs and all those guys. And Burroughs and Ginsberg and those people came to CBGB's a lot, but he doesn't realize that. He just sees the snarling poses and the mohawk hairdos, and he thinks it's really awful. And then slowly, as the novel unfolds, he begins to get exposed as he's trying to help Finn and Julie solve the murder, begins to get exposed to their world and begins to realize that there's a lot more going on in the punk of 1977 than he had supposed. And there's an epilogue. Well, this is not a spoiler, but it's just an epilogue that takes place today when he's now in his 80s. And he and Julie are on their way to a Patti Smith concert at the beginning because he's in love with Patti Smith and wouldn't miss it for the world. So I loved his arc. I wanted him to be a stand-in for readers who don't know that much about punk in that era, because I read at some point a couple of years ago, somebody had done an opinion poll, like Pew Research or somebody like that, to ask people's opinions of different musical genres, hip hop, rock and roll, dance music, whatever, ambient, any kind of pop music. And punk rock came in dead last. It had like a 3% positive rating amongst the American people that they and I thought, oh, wow, that makes sense because it's been very misunderstood. People think of punk as more like hardcore. What you would think of as people today think of punk as sort of hardcore, just angry people, the Sex Pistols, beginning of the Sex Pistols and sort of Ramones kind of thing. And that was definitely part of it, but that was not all of it. It wasn't even most of it back then. So I wanted a character in the book to start out that way, despising punk, and then slowly realize what it really was and finally go, oh my God, this is actually fantastic stuff. And I want in. So that was the arc of Detective Sharon.
I thought of the actor Mark Ruffalo as the perfect, he's played that kind of character before.
He would be great. Right?
It's the first person I thought of when I'm reading it.
There's a parlor game going on of people trying to cast this book, like who's going to play the parts in this book. And so, whether it will ever become a movie, I have no idea, but a lot of people think that it should. And they're sitting around going, who's going to play this? And
it would make for a fantastic movie. I mean, you've got the allure of the CBGB era and the punk rock and all of that, but also it's a great murder mystery. It would be It would be a fantastic movie. Find the Booked on Rock website at bookedonrock.com. There you can find all the back episodes of the show, the latest episode in video and audio, links to all of the platforms where you can listen to the podcast, plus all the social media platforms. We're on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and X. Also, check out the Booked on Rock blog, find your local independent bookstore, find out all the latest hot rock book releases, and before you go, check out the Booked on Rock online store. Pick up some Booked on Rock merch. It's all at bookedonrock.com. Without giving anything away, perhaps creating even more curiosity here, you briefly weave in a recognizable New York real estate figure from that era as well. Did adding a real figure associated with the city's future help the novel move from a period piece into more of maybe a historical perspective?
Well, yeah, it's hard to talk about this because there are spoilers, but let it just suffice to say that when I constructed the plot, I wanted the reason for the murders that happened then and the planned mayhem that happened then in the course of this story to directly relate to the New York City that exists today. And so I did that. And when you finally find out who done it, as they say in the murder mystery biz, who done it has everything to do with the way that New York City is today. So I wove that character in, and we will not say his name, but there's a number of other characters. I mean, like Roy Cohn is the famous Roy Cohn from the McCarthy hearings, and then all the terrible things. He's a major character in Angels in America, the Tony Kushner play. He is a character in this book. And Steve Rubell from Studio 54 and Truman Capote. We go uptown, we come downtown. It's centered on downtown, but Julie's uptown, and so you see that world. And that was going strong too. 1977 was the year of Studio 54. That was the year when you think of disco, and there was a big dichotomy between disco in New York and the downtown scene. The downtown scene just hated, I used to go, and Steven Sprouse used to take me to Studio 54 because he could always just waltz right in, and we would go there together. And
what was that like being in there?
It was wild. It was just like what you think of it. You never knew who you were going to see. It was celebrities like everywhere you looked. And then downstairs there was this basement. There, I tell you what was going on down there. It was or even what was going on up in the balcony. There was a lot of actual sex went on in Studio 54, not on the dance floor, but upstairs in the balcony and stuff like that. It was really, really wild. But you didn't really want to tell your friends at CB's or at Max's that you had even gone there because it was so uncool on that scene. And yet, from a cultural point of view, what was coming out of New York in 1977 on that level, which was disco, what was going on there had more of a cultural impact. I mean, that's what led to, Saturday Night Fever and all those kinds of things, which really did change culture all over the United States. I mean, young kids put on their disco shoes and people opened discotheques all over the country, and everybody was, you make me feel like dancing. So it was, that was really going on.
Did you see a lot of the SNL cast members there, the original Saturday Night Live cast?
Don't really remember seeing them. I know that they did go there.
Did you see them around the city? I mean, they must have been around.
I don't. That's funny. I don't really remember bumping into Saturday Night Live because I know that John Belushi went there and Dan Aykroyd went there, but I guess not on the nights that I went there. I just didn't notice them or whatever. There was always people. I mean, the one thing that was very cool about CB's was that there was absolutely zero rock star pretension stuff going on. You know what I mean? It was like you could approach anybody. I mean, the first time that I met Deborah Harry, I had seen her play a week or two before there. This was like right at the very beginning. And then I walked in one night to see somebody else, and she was sitting at a table by herself. And I just walked over to her and said, hey, I saw you play the other night, and I know that you're friends with Steven, and I think that you're friends with my friend Paul. And oh, right, you're Gabriel. And there was just, there was just this, it was just like that. There was no like, why are you talking to me? I'm a rock star kind of person. And it really did stay that way, even after people became famous. The other fun thing about CB's, by the way, was that Hilly had a policy where you could go outside and come back in. It wasn't like you went in, you paid your money, and then you're in, and if you come out, you're out. So there was a huge scene on the sidewalk. The scene on the sidewalk was just as important as the scene that was going on inside. And of course, it was in a weird way, even though you were on the Bowery, it was kind of nicer on the sidewalk because CB's just so, it was like smoke filled. It kind of stank. They never cleaned the place. It was like really a mess in there. Whereas on the sidewalk, at least you're breathing what passes for fresh air
Right.
in New York City. And when you see pictures, even today, if you just go online and just type in CBGB images and stuff, a lot of the images will be from the sidewalk outside, and you will see Joey Ramone talking to Alex Chilton, and you'll see, Tom Verlaine with his arm around Patti Smith, and there are just groups of people all just hanging out, smoking cigarettes, drinking beer, and outside. And so it was that, and no pretension and no bull at all.
Yeah, I heard all the bands would help each other. There was no competition or envy, anything like that.
Bands not only helped each other, they used each other's equipment. And people would set up instead of having to have 4 sound checks if you knew because Hilly was so devoted to new music that once it got going, he began having 3 and sometimes 4 bands a night because he was trying to give everybody a chance. And it's one of the reasons why the scene gestated that way, because he was giving people a chance. And if you knew the other 3 bands that were playing, you would say, hey, can we just set up? We'll do our sound check, and then you can just use our equipment instead of, having to lug everything off and move everything back on again between each set. And people just shared their equipment. And they shared their girlfriends, and they shared their boyfriends, and they shared drugs, and they shared their cigarettes, and they shared everything. It was a very communal kind of scene.
And sadly, today it's a clothing store, right?
It is John Varvados's clothing store, and it is sad. I mean, it got put out of business by gentrification. It used to be that there was a flop house, if you will. I don't know what the right term for that is, but these missions would open these places for the Bowery bums where there would be like dormitory beds, and you could rent a bed for 25 cents a night. And then in the morning, they kicked you out. And you went out and you drank on the street, you drank your Thunderbird or your Ripple out of a paper bag, and then at night you paid your 25 cents and you went back in. And upstairs from CB's was one of those places. It was called the Palace Hotel, but it was a flop house. And eventually it was sold by whatever mission ran it to some real estate person, and they jacked up Hilly's rent to a level that he could not afford. And it was put out of business in 2003 or something like that.
It was 2006. I'm looking online.
2006, yeah.
Surprising it lasted that long.
Oh yeah, and it was still going strong right to the end. It was still going strong right to the end. But John Varvados opened it as a clothing store. He has a very super high-end clothing store. I mean, everything is. I mean, a T-shirt is $200 in there, and then everything is up from there. But I have to say this for John Varvados. He is well aware that he is in a sacred space. And so he had a new awning built that says John Varvados. That's exactly in the shape of the old CBGB's awning. And when you walk in, it looks kind of like CBGB's. There's actually a stage in the back with a drum kit and some amps on it, roughly where the original stage of CBGB's used to be. And he pays homage to the fact that he is basically camping out in this sacred space. And that's a lot nicer. I mean, the other great club of that era was Max's Kansas City, which was on 17th Street and Park Avenue South. That was also a sacred space. That goes back even further than CB's because Max's was where the Warhol scene hung out in the back room of Max's starting in 1965 with Baby Jane Holzer and Holly Woodlawn and Lou Reed and all those people. All the people that Lou sings about in Walk on the Wild Side were the people hanging out in the back room of Max's in the 60s. And then it had a second life in the 70s as the main competition to CBGB. So I consider that to be just as sacred space as CB's, and that has been turned into one of those giant Korean delis. And, it's like you can buy sandwiches there, or you can buy anything there, hot plates all over the place, and it's like neon lit. I think it's open 24 hours a day. And when you walk in there, trying to close your eyes and imagine that this is where we played. I mean, I played there on New Year's Eve of 1980. That was one of the two best gigs that you could get, in the year. New Year's Eve is the best night to play, and CB's and Max's were the two best places to play, and I had that gig.
What was the name of your band?
That was Brenda and the Real Tones.
Okay.
This great singer, Brenda Bergman, and Brenda and the Real Tones. I go in there sometimes when I'm in the city. I'll walk in the deli to buy a bag of potato chips or whatever, just to go in there and just sort of kind of close your eyes and feel that you're in that space. And you can't really feel that you're just in this giant neon lit delicatessen. Whereas at CB's with John Varvatos' clothing company, you do feel that you're in CBGB. So it's kind of nice that he did that.
The Booked on Rock podcast is part of the Boneless Podcasting Network. If you're a fan of classic rock and classic film like I am, go to boneless.lovable.app to find over 20 great shows there. That's boneless.lovable.app, or just go to bookedonrock.com, the Boneless Podcasting Network. It is what you want it to be. Listen with confidence. One last question for you, and get somewhat philosophical here, okay? Is the CBGB Conspiracy ultimately a murder mystery or a story about a moment in time that was destined to end?
I think that it is a moment in time that was destined to end. I mean, I thought of it as a murder mystery. That's what I wrote it as. And then when I got an agent and it started going out to publishers, everyone said, well, this is a historical novel. It's a historical novel. It's comparable to something like The Alienist by Caleb Carr or Ragtime by E.L. Doctorow, where you take a particular period in time and you add in the real characters, President Theodore Roosevelt or, whatever that were around at that time, and you make them characters in your book. So it is considered to be a historical novel. And I didn't think of that. I was surprised when people said that. For one thing, I was surprised. It was like, well, it can't be history. It's my life. What are you talking about? I'm not that old, They're like, oh, no, yes, you are. 50 years ago is definitely history, so for sure it is. So that's what it is. But for me, it's a coming of age story. It is a murder mystery. It is a story about how people can overcome whatever bad stuff is put in their way. It's a story about rock and roll and the genesis of rock and roll. And it is a love story. It's a lot of things, but ultimately it's a historical novel set in that era.
Well, not if, when it gets turned into a film. I want you to come back on.
I will be glad to.
The CBGB Conspiracy, it's out now, and it's wherever books are sold. Look for it at your nearest bookstore. Go to bookedonrock.com to find your nearest independent bookstore and see if they have a copy there. If they don't, tell them to get one. Where can people find you online, Gabriel?
I am on Facebook. I'm not a big social media person. I also have a website, gabrielrotello.com, where I have things about the CBGB Conspiracy. So that's probably the best place.
Yeah, people can contact you through the website.
And they can contact me. My contact information is on the website.
Perfect.
Yep.
Gabriel Rotello, thank you so much. This is a fascinating discussion about an era I wish I could say I lived through, but I was not old enough, but so many people wish they had, and you lived through it. So thank you so much for sharing your story and for writing such a fantastic book.
Eric, thank you so much. And thanks for the podcast. It's really terrific.
That's it. It's in the books.